Emmett Till, the murder that changed the world. Emmett Till and the effects of his murder on civil rights in the United States. In August of 1955, 14-year-old Emmett Till would visit Bryant's grocery and meat market while on a trip to Mississippi. There, he whistled at 21-year-old cashier Carolyn Bryant. That night, Emmett would be heinously kidnapped, beat, and killed by Bryant's husband and brother-in-law. Less than a month later, Emmett's murderers would be acquitted by a white male jury. This would go on to shock the nation. Emmett Till's murder and the acquittal of his murderers was a turning point in the fight for civil rights, as it changed the way Americans saw violence against African Americans. In a time where white people in America faced little consequences for racist acts, Emmett's death proved that this had to change. During the time of Emmett's murder, the racial landscape of America was wildly different from the modern day. Black people faced discrimination in all aspects of life. These racist beliefs started from the immoral practice of slavery. This practice made it socially acceptable to treat black people as subhuman. Even after the abolishment of slavery in 1865, the legal and economic status surrounding race severely put black people at a disadvantage, especially in the southern United States. A large part of this came with the establishment of black codes and Jim Crow laws. These laws came about in the era after the Civil War. America grappled with how to bring newly freed black people into society. During this time, Southern white Americans resented new laws aimed to help African Americans. Black codes and Jim Crow laws were created to undo any gains African Americans made at this time. In 1865, black codes were implemented through increased imprisonment of black people, restricting job opportunities, and more. To combat these new Southern legislation, Congress passed the 14th and 15th Amendment to help uplift African Americans. However, as the northern states lessened their involvement in Southern affairs, Jim Crow laws and segregation came into place. In the Jim Crow era, interactions between black men and white women were especially restricted. A black male couldn't even offer his hand to a white woman because he risked being accused of rape. To quote, protect these white women, many southern white communities used lynchings as a way to punish black men. In general, lynchings were used to scare and silence black people and were commonplace in the southern United States until the late 1960s. Thousands of lynchings took place annually. Although there was an early anti-lynching movement led by prominent activist Ida B. Wells, little was done to criminalize lynchings. Lynchings were rarely ever prosecuted and so desensitized that pictures of lynchings would go on postcards. These realities of lynching and segregation were not prevalent where Emmett grew up in urban Chicago. Even though racism was still prevalent in the North, black people enjoyed many more rights and opportunities. In fact, while Emmett was growing up in Chicago, the city had one of the biggest and most successful black communities in the US. In contrast, in Money, Mississippi, where Emmett was murdered, not one African American was registered to vote. In this area, black people were expected to stay subordinate to their white counterparts. Unfortunately, Emmett's lack of knowledge of these social differences between the North and the South cost him his life. Emmett Till was born on July 25th in 1941 in Chicago, Illinois. He was raised by his mother, Mamie Till, and led a middle-class life. Emmett was often described as extremely kind by family and friends. Although Emmett was from Chicago, he had extended family in Mississippi. So, despite his mother's objections, Emmett left for Mississippi alone. Knowing her son's joking nature, Mamie warned Emmett about Southern racial intolerance. Nevertheless, Emmett left for Mississippi to stay with his cousins and great-uncle, Moses Wright. This would be the last time Mamie would see her son. After his arrival in Mississippi, Till and his cousins spent their days picking cotton, as Moses Wright was a sharecropper. On August 28, 1955, 3 days after Emmett arrived in Mississippi, Till and his cousins headed to Bryant's grocery and meat market, owned by Carolyn and Roy Bryant. While at the store, Emmett, unaware of Southern racial dynamics, whistled at then 21-year-old white cashier Carolyn Bryant. This misunderstanding would not only cost Emmett his life, but also create a turning point regarding civil rights in the US. Later on in the day, Carolyn Bryant would come home and tell her husband Roy Bryant that Till tried to assault her. Later that night, Roy Bryant and his half-brother J.W. Milam would go on to kidnap Emmett from his great-uncle's home. Bryant and Milam would go on to severely beat Emmett, gouge his eyes out, and kill him with a gunshot to the head. They would go on to attach Emmett's body to a cotton gin before throwing him into the Tallahatchie River. Emmett's great-uncle reported the crime swiftly, and Bryant and Milam were quickly arrested. Emmett's body wouldn't be found until 3 days later in the Tallahatchie River. The body was only recognizable because of an engraved ring given to Emmett by his late father. When Mamie Till, Emmett's mother, received her son's body, she was overcome with grief and horror. Mamie Till later wrote, "They had to see what I had seen. The whole nation had to bear witness to this," when talking about her son's murder. For this reason, Mamie Till decided Emmett's funeral would be an open casket. Little did she know that this decision would be a turning point in civil rights in the US. Over 50,000 people would come to Emmett's funeral in Chicago. People were shocked by his injuries. Many newspapers were at Till's funeral, including prominent black newspapers and magazines, including Jet magazine and the Chicago Defender. These newspapers would go on to publish pictures of Emmett's body, which would only increase emotions surrounding this case for both black and white people. Subsequently, Bryant and Milam were put on trial. The unanimous consensus among Mississippians was that Bryant and Milam were guilty. On the flip side, even though their guilt was obvious, many Mississippians resented both recent efforts of integration and Mamie Till. This was because Mamie Till was misquoted into saying she wanted Mississippi to pay for the crimes against her son. At that time in Mississippi, women and black people were barred from juries, but even then, most people saw Bryant and Milam as guilty. Unfortunately, despite this fact, one of the attorneys for Bryant and Milam worked for the county. So, when it came to jury selection, the defense attorney made sure to choose people who were the most racist and most resentful towards Mamie. The trial started in September of 1955 and was extremely short, only lasting 5 days, but all fingers were pointing towards Milam and Bryant. Shockingly, jury deliberation would only last 67 minutes. Within that time, the jury decided to acquit both Milam and Bryant and drop them of all their charges. This decision would shock the nation, sparking the emotions that would lead to the civil rights movement. Emmett Till's murder served as a turning point for race relations in the South, as it made people understand that the injustices against black people had persisted for too long. Emmett Till's death inspired leaders of the civil rights movement like MLK Jr. and Malcolm X. In a world where murdering innocent black people was the norm, Emmett's death served as a glaring reminder that this had to change. Before Emmett's death, lynchings were used as a means of silencing black people. But now, people had to see the atrocities black people faced, a huge turning point in American history. Emmett's death invoked such emotion that it encouraged young black people to fight for change. It was these emotions that surrounded Till's murder that inspired people like Rosa Parks. In fact, when Rosa Parks was asked why she didn't step to the back of the bus, she said, "I thought of Emmett Till and couldn't go back." This generation of people like Rosa Parks was known as the Emmett Till generation. This generation of young black people helped spur the civil rights movement through peaceful protests and sit-ins. Emmett Till's death was a turning point in America, as it showed the nation that America had to change. Today, segregation and Jim Crow laws no longer exist because of the Emmett Till generation. Their efforts helped create the America we know today. Aside from raising the emotions that led to the civil rights movement, effects of Emmett's death still linger. As recently as 2022, the Senate signed in the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act, which makes lynchings a federal hate crime. Unfortunately, racism is still extremely prevalent in America today. In terms of racial justice, Till's death shows how far we have come and how far society still needs to go. Though the atrocities Emmett had to endure were heinous and his murder trial was extremely unfair, without his case, emotions around civil rights may not have reached the level needed to create change. Emmett Till's death served as a turning point for young Americans to fight for justice and equality. Emmett's death inspired the youth of the 1950s that they had to fight for a better, more equal tomorrow.